Collective Awakening podcast,
sharing truth and knowledge in this time of conscious awakening
with Chris and Stephen. Hello friends, and welcome to the Collective Awakening podcast. Absolute pleasure to be with you again. Chris and Stephen here, sharing truth and knowledge with like-minded souls, and we welcome another like-minded soul today, John Hogue. John is a professor. He's done much on Nostradamus, so much work actually, a futurist in many ways. He's written over 52 books and so much more. We've stumbled across his work and we thought, wow, what an interesting guest to be with us on the Collective Awakening podcast. So really looking forward to this time here, and we're really going to get on with it and get as much information in this episode as we can and much nourishment. So welcome, John. It's great to have you with us.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me on.
A pleasure to have you, John. Absolutely amazing. Great honor.
Yes, so maybe what I should do now is introduce to your audience in brief what I'm all about.
Absolutely.
It's true, I am a futurist, but I am essentially anti-prophetic. Just as my teacher, Osho, my spiritual teacher, was anti-sex, though most people would think he was a free sex guru. And of course, our joke was always to look back at people saying, you're a free sex guru. I said, well, that's true. We didn't pay for our sex, so that's true. And so, but his idea was to be most anti-sex guru on the planet because it was all about taking people positively through their sexuality to superconsciousness. Now, in the same way, I learned from him a tantric approach to prophecy. Most prophecy, what we call prophecy, is actually projection that is based on unconscious habits that people are programmed, and everybody comes in as a Buddha, as an awakened one, as a Christ consciousness. And then the conditioning process begins to help you pretend. You have to play the worldly game, which is, now, son, we want you to pretend that for a little bit, that you're not a Buddha. And if you do, we will reward you. You'll be able to be in our world. Okay, well, I'll do that. So the child is total. So the child plays the game. He forgets he's a Buddha, and he forgets it's a game. And then there's this whole process of trying to come back, trying to find what was lost. And that is another trap, because you cannot find what you already are. You can just remember that you are this, the Buddha nature. You can't. And for millions of lives, people encouraged by the dogma of the Buddhist religion, and all the religions do this, they're basically corporate, high-class political situations. They take a living master and turn him into some statue and apply to that master all kinds of things that had nothing to do with him, because of course, if you're the enlightened person and you die, the unenlightened people are left to explain what happened. And they usually don't get it very right. So this is true about all religions. So I'm not just hitting Buddhists, I hit everybody. So the idea is to understand what I came to understand from initially in 1962 in October. My life was shocked as I was in the last days of my 6th year, coming into my 7th on October 29th, when the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. And if it had not been agreed by Dobrynin and Robert F. Kennedy, if that agreement had not been come to agreement, the war would have started on my 7th birthday. And we probably all wouldn't be here right now. At a very young age, I was suddenly shocked, because I had my first of 4 premonitions in my life, major premonitions. And, I kind of saw a jet crashing and an engine in a field. And my parents were going to go off to Las Vegas to the Sands Hotel, I think it was, to be at a dinner party with the president, who was going around at that time campaigning for midterm elections. And I had this premonition that they were going to die in this crash. And I was freaking out. They came back. What happens often when our premonitions come is that we tend to project our own ego narcissism naturally upon things. It's all about me. Something's wrong with my life, my parents, the thing like that. But soon enough, a few days after, on Monday, they were there on Saturday. On a Monday, the following Monday, there was Kennedy telling the whole world that there was a Cuban Missile Crisis, and any attack on any nation in the Western Hemisphere will be considered an attack on the United States, which will require a complete retaliatory response. So, I mean, it's not science fiction anymore. It's fact, potentially. So that was that made me, ever since, a news junkie. I had an interest in what was going on in the world. I started reading voraciously history like a doctor trying to understand a pathology, and read thousands of books on history, and saw also patterns that seemed to keep repeating themselves. Different costumes, different names for different religions, different names for different countries, but always kind of the same rut, the same misery go round is what I call the wheel of samsara. And so I started to get more into religious things, and then I started reading all the scriptures, and of course came upon all the prophecies of religions. And primarily in middle school, I discovered Nostradamus, and that was a very big change. And over a century now, I have been considered a world authority on Nostradamus, and I would contend that I'm the last kind of Nostradamian scholar left standing who has done the many years of study that is required. Now everybody can interpret Nostradamus, and they write books, and they're doing things like, oh, well, I don't know if this translation is correct, but I hope it is, and I'll just write a book about it. And I learned early on is you cannot judge what's good unless you learn how to translate Nostradamus' 16th century grammar in French and his other languages involved. So I had to do that. Now I read it, I don't speak it. No, Nostradamus had his own language. So if I say I speak Nostradamian French, nobody's going to understand me because it's so I read it and I learned it, and that took 20 years. And I think you can't really start publishing books until at least a decade into the study minimum. That's what I did. And my first book was highly successful because it broke out of the mold of usually scholarly books. It was scholarly, but it also was a magazine style book called Nostradamus and the Millennium. And it was done by Doubleday Dolphin. It sold 800,000 copies in 9 languages. It was kind of my Citizen Kane moment. And just as Orson Welles used to say, you only need one big hit to just keep going. And in the process, you're obviously in something that's a big, wide audience sell. I mean, my work has been evolving over the years to kind of lower my readership because I'm taking people to places that require a lot of guts for my readers to look at. And, the other thing that has happened over all this time is that when I was writing about these things in the late 80s, it was all far away. The 2020s were far, far away. The millennium was even far, far away. So, people love horror films, so they like to get scared. Well, people sometimes like scary prophecy books because they like to be scared too. But it started to not be so entertaining when we got into the 1990s and things were starting to happen. And so the audience changed. Now my audience is far braver, maybe less, except that it is more in my appearances on media. And anyway, this is the general process that we're going through, which Nostradamus predicted about our time, said, oh, what a great loss in learning and letters, talking about our times, that, people were being dumbed down. And yeah. So it's so that was happening. But what also happened in '87 is I started to have a media career, and so a lot of people listened to me. Millions and millions of people, a lot of people, and hundreds of millions have seen me on TV and all over the world. And the most significant one of this, because not only do I champion Nostradamus, but I also champion Edgar Cayce and St. Malachi's Papal Prophecies, which I wrote a best-selling book on that. I'm upgrading that book now because I think a change is going to probably come in the next 18 months. And but that's a whole other story we can do on another show. This is kind of the show of Meet Mr. Hogue and Mr. Hogue's World, and we will do other shows hopefully on just specific subjects that we can go deep into. So what happened, I was telling you before the show about this, that there was a significant historical event that I there were two historical events related to prophecy that I've been involved with. When I was in the Oregon commune and Osho's commune in America, one thing led to another, and I was one of three people that was going to be sent to the Hopi lands to contact Grandfather David, who was kind of the spiritual leader of the Hopi at that time. And how it actually worked out is I, at the last minute, had to stay and do my security job, but the other two went. But strangely enough, they reported everything to me, and their job was pretty much done in those few days. But ever since 1985, I have been the witness, the scholar, the writer about what happened and how, because the Hopis had a great interest in us as we had in them, because a lot of things that we were doing was kind of paralleling the last final warnings of Hopi prophecy. You know, once the gourd of ashes is lit near Hopi lands, and by the way, a Hopi gourd is a round thing with a thin stick. Now, if you turn that upside down, it looks like an atomic blast. So Alamogordo, New Mexico, very near to the Hopi lands. So when that happened, and when the great Reds, those great men, people, the swastika, and there was a third one too, but anyway, when those people happened, they realized that the time had come to tell the people of the world their prophecies, which had been for 1,000 years just passed down through oral history. Now they were going to speak out loud about it, because these are the final signs. Now, one of the final signs, I mean, some of them are very interesting. I mean, they said when you see cobwebs crisscrossing the sky, you know, the great purification by fire is upon us. Well, that's contrails. And when you string up wires on posts, well, that's telegraph wires. When they bring strange deer with very long horns, you know, that's the ranchers, white ranchers. And there's the important story of the Hopi creator of the universe had created a Hopi red brother who was the younger, and the white brother was the Pahana, the older. And the white brother was the yang. The red brother was the yin, you know, farming and healing. And the white brother was the scientist who was going to go out and be objective and come back in the world. And they broke a tablet. The maker of all things broke this stone tablet and gave the two the tablet. When the white brother came back to his red brother, the Soknuknyan, I think is the name of the great creator of the universe, he said, if your brother comes back with a tablet with a circle in it, drawn on it, then he has gained wisdom, totality, the all of wisdom. But if he comes back with a cross, he's false Pahana. So this is 1,000 years before anybody in the Hopi lands or the other 500 nations, which have similar prophecies. They were all seeing this coming. And what they also saw is that there would be a man with a white beard, olive skin face, a Quetzalcoatl figure who would fly out of the sky. And his people would be the red cap, red cloak tribe. They would come into the West in many, many numbers, into the Hopi lands, and all my friends were going in there in their red clothes and mala. And And so, first the Tibetans came in a delegation to see them, the Hopis in the 60s, because of Padmasambhava's famous prophecy, the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, an Indian mystic. And he said, when the wheel, this is back in 7th century, I think, when the wheel comes to the Tibetan lands and the iron horse, the Tibetan people will be scattered like ants all over the world. And the Dharma, the religious practice, will move to the land of the red men. So in the 7th century, they knew about America.
Wow.
And so, and there's two ways that's possible. If you understand the Tibetan, one of the most fascinating things about Tibet, before the Red Chinese came in and destroyed much of it, is that there was a discipline that used to happen where a Tibetan monk would be put into a cave, which would be slowly walled in very carefully so that his eyes would get used to the darkness, because he would be living in total darkness. And there was a special shelf that they could put through where his sampa, his meal of sampa and water and stuff, could be brought in by a chela, a boy monk, every day. Because it was so cold, he could defecate in the corner, it would just turn to powder. And so that's how he lived in the cave. And what happens is, living in meditation, these monks would astral travel. And so Tibet was journeying all over. I contend that the Tibetans knew a lot about the world because they were astral traveling to America. They knew about that because eventually these guys would, very slowly after years, they would make a little hole and then open so more sun came in, but very carefully so not to blind them from the light. And of course they told about their experiences. And that's, I think, where probably the Tibetans knew about red man and other peoples around the world because they were traveling. And I find that very interesting because I was also one of the people in Robert Monroe, Journeys Out of the Body, Robert Monroe's 60,000 Gateway program, where 60,000 people, he was trying to do research. He was a great researcher as well as a mystic, trying to find out what, in a pool of 60,000 people, what kind of astral travel experiences they had. So I was involved in that before I went to India. So what had happened that I find significant for our times, although I never was seeking this, but it is significant, is that we have in America Edgar Cayce, who is considered the greatest prophet of American that we know of in America, and he died in 1945. But in 1934 through 1944, he was making 3 major trance. He did things that he's called the sleeping prophet because he used to get on the couch and go out, and then his wife and secretary would bear witness, and the secretary would stenograph everything he was saying. And they did something that I do, because I think everybody who makes predictions should do this. And I don't know, I know why a lot of them are afraid to do it, because they don't really want to confront exactly how accurate or inaccurate they can be. So everything I say gets documented, taped, and written down, just like Cayce did. He had almost 14,000 trance sessions, or more than 14,000. Most of them were about healing and reincarnation and other things, but he also had some very, very accurate prophecies, doing what is actually very hard in prophecy, dating things. Now, Nostradamus did that too. It's very hard for a lot of unconscious, past-oriented projections into the future to be to all happen robotically, so that they happen on a time hundreds of years in the future, or just a dozen days even. It's very, very hard. So Cayce suddenly got into this readings for the nations in 1944, at the time when Russia was a Bolshevik, was a Soviet Union, and completely communist, and we were starting to go sour with them as allies. He said something very surprising in the trance. He said, "What of Russia?" He said, "Russia is the hope of the world. Not the current Bolshevistic Russia. But he kind of implied that farther down, it'll take time, a lot of time, but much farther down the future, there would be another Russia. And it would return to God. It would return to Orthodox, basically is what he's saying. And that it would be the hope of the world. Now, he didn't explain exactly how, and he probably didn't know how. I mean, you know, we kind of assume that prophets have to know what they're looking at.
Yeah.
And they don't. They're just like going, well, this thing happened, that thing happened. This weird beast with the ears that flap like this were coming in the picture, and it looked like a big grasshopper. And I don't know. That's all I'm telling you. He's not going to say, well, that's a helicopter. No, it's that's for us to detect as detectives, as forsooth sayers, you know, as investigators. It's our burden to decipher prophecies, not the prophets, because it's about our times or anticipating our times. So the question then happened is, okay, there is a certain set of Nostradamian prophecies. In fact, one of the best documentaries I was ever on in America, most of them are crap, but I had a French director, and she was ready to fight tooth and nail, make sure this was not turned into the usual pablum and drivel through editing. And I would say out of hundreds that I did, there's only 2 that I'm happy with over all these years. Next Nostradamus and the other Nostradamus, which is this thing I'm talking about. And she was the person who did the first pilot for Deadliest Catch. So she currently does Naked and Afraid. And so she's still working. I'd love to work with her again, but she fought tooth and nail, and that thing was not turned into crap. And it's a comparison documentary about Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce. And so I've been aware for a long time of certain signs, and I was watching them like a hawk, because if they happened, that means a second Cold War was coming that had a much more likely chance of going nuclear, between 2 great kings of the north called Aquilon. That is the Aquilonaires, the Eagle Kings, because he called them great kings of the north, and sometimes he called one of them Amarish or America, even though America is also Brittany, but like a thin French nose on the land of France, it's pointing towards the west. So these great kings, he talked about them first in a quatrain that ended in was indexed as Century 2, Volume 2, quatrain, 4-line poem 89. Now, my late colleague Mario Reading did make a unfortunately major mistake by trying to cram all the quatrains into their quatrain numbers into dates. There are many that could be dates, but like everything in Nostradamus, it's like Hackham's razor. He's obscure not to be turned into order. He's obscure because he's a chaos. And out of chaos, order is born. So there will be patterns of order that will rise and fall. But if you find 2 or 3 or even 10, please don't presume to make all the quatrains fit as dates. They can't, because that would imply Nostradamus is a more ordered man and ordered prophet than he was. And I think that's been my success. I didn't do that. You know, being a meditator, that is my main spiritual path, a witnessing consciousness of the changes in my life, seen neither for nor against by this witness, like becoming a mirror that perfectly reflects. Does a mirror judge what it reflects? No, it reflects perfectly what's before it. And like Krishnamurti used to say, if you just let things reflect, if you gain that neck, He used to say, he was a fear type, so he often would use fear as the example. He said, "What is fear? Look right into it. See it, allow it. Just don't do anything. Just let it grow before you like a plant, and show its roots through the fear, its flowering of fear. And in the watching, understanding happens, and then things just drop. You cannot become what you already are, the whole cosmos. But society can turn you, as it does all of us, into an idiot. As Gurdjieff, the great mystic from Russia, once said, Armenian Greek mystic from Tsarist Russia, who died in Paris in 1949. He used to reverently call his disciples when talking to them in groups, said, "You idiots, will you come and dig this? And oh, you idiots now can fix the meal." And he meant it reverently, because to be called an idiot in the proper way is not that you're dumb and stupid, although stupidity and dumbness and misunderstanding is rife if you identify with this illusion of being separate from the whole cosmos, which comes from the word idios, which in its ancient Greek meanings, which is always two, it has the obvious meaning, achieving a separation from the rest of the world, an identity. Idios, identity, id, idiosyncratic, idiot. It all comes from the same root of idios. But the thing that is not stated is the deeper meaning, that this is a delusion. Maya is not about the world being illusory. It's about our understanding being illusory. This phenomenal world exists. It exists in phenomenon. It's constantly changing. It's never the same. It's never constant. It exists. And if you believe it doesn't, I've got a rock here that I can throw on your big toe, and you'll be hopping. And I'll say, "Why are you hopping? Why this pain? It's not there. It doesn't exist, right?"
Yeah.
No, it exists.
Yeah.
So the problem is that being an idiot under the illusion of being separate from the whole makes us predictable. Being a witness to the idiot, understanding the idiot, just watching the movie of the idiot, it's not a doing, because doing feeds ego. So you have to learn how to. My path to meditation started from my being had a very potentially great opera singing career before me in the 1970s. And I learned the vocal essence. My teacher was William Chapman, one of the lead baritones in New York City Opera, and he taught Raymond Smoliver's vocal essence approach, which is a form of role theme for the voice by holding your fingers at a certain spot, and that helps you differentiate between the voluntary and involuntary muscles. And what happens is, so the analogy of singing is just like the analogy of life. I found was that in all the vocal coaches, they say sing in your head, support your diaphragm, sing out of your elbow, even some of them do, or be this floating air column and your ping pong ball. That's a little closer. But what we did is we stripped all of that and just, what is the voice? It's an involuntary system. And the whole process of learning how to really sing is to be aware of, like with his fingers being in my throat, he used to say to me, "Look, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to put my fingers in your throat and you're going to start singing," Bill said. And he said, "If you hold, and all I'm doing is keeping my fingers in position. Just remember that." Okay. So I started singing, and I felt like he went right into my throat. I said, "Ow." And it came off, you just poked me in the throat. No, I didn't. I just held my fingers. Your voice box with your sternomastoid muscles, which shouldn't ever be used, pushed me out. So the body sees a thing, it understands a thing, and then it drops the thing, because now it has new body memory. And in exactly the same way, that's why Buddha made this revolutionary jump in the history of enlightenment and the evolution of it. He sought an involuntary function of the body that you do 24/7, that can be watched. The breath going in, going out, not changing it, just watching it. And that was vipassana. And that was the meditation that revolutionized things, because he finally had a technique, involuntary, that you can use 24/7. You can go to sleep watching your breath. You can eventually even watch your breath while you're dreaming. You can awake watching your breath. And if meditation isn't 24/7, it's just a game. Oh, isn't that nice? He's doing an hour of consciousness while he walks the rest of his day like a robot. You have to watch the robot. You have to be there. You have to watch. Osho used to say, oh, it's very easy to watch when you're hurting or pain and all that, but try to watch when you're happy and everything's fine. That's more important, because that's where you go to sleep. Oh, I'm happy now. You can put meditation down lower on the laundry list, and then everything goes bad again. And so it's harder actually to watch yourself when you're happy and everything's going. There's a fear that it's going to be like self-conscious and you're going to lose the happiness. But after a while, it's fine. And then what he said is right. In my own experience, he said, if you do that, you will find your happiness lingers longer. And
wow.
Yeah.
We're really interested, actually, John, as well. Myself and Steve, and we practice here at our centre, our wellbeing centre, the Osho dynamic breathwork, which we've really found great success in. And like with many people, there's a lot been written of Osho and a lot of documentaries, etc. I'd love to hear about your personal experience with him, that real truth of the essence of who he was.
Well, he was the most amazing man I've ever, or woman, man, woman, whatever, human being that I've ever had in any of my lives. And he was, my first impression of him sitting in 1980 in Pune, India on the 15th of October, Nietzsche's birthday. Out of my chaos, a dancing star was about to be born. And the funny thing was that there were like 7 of us up against the wall next to his chair, and we were looking at him, and he had this luminosity. It was very, I mean, you see it in the pictures. It's not, some of that's not staged. It's really like, yeah, that's him. And in fact, to make the point, one of my books here has a picture of the moment that I was initiated. Here I am at 25, and you can see I'm into the guy. I want to jump right in and disappear. So here's Mr. One over here. Whoops, I have to do this backwards. Mr. One over here. And look how still he is. He's touching me, and he's like, look how he's like, he's there, but he isn't there. And that luminosity is not just the overhead light. There's just, it's subtle, but it's, I'm watching him talking to me. What he did is he reached, and people were telling me, oh, you're going to have this happen. The mountains are going to move. The skies are going to fall. Everything's going to. And what happened when he leaned in and touched me was a little electric shock on my third eye. And then I was absolutely soaked with a non-event, a completely ordinary nothing. And I've come over time to realize that there's nothing more ordinary and more ubiquitous than enlightenment. And that's why everybody misses it, because they're trying to make it into something else. That they're trying, it's got to be a goal, an achievement, a sternomastoid muscle trying to make music. It's got to be voluntary. But it is involuntary. We are involuntarily enlightened. We are always been Buddhas and always will be Buddhas. And if we keep going through this process of being conditioned, we will be taught to, as Osho used to say, when people ask him, what do you see when you see all of us in front of you? And he used to say, I see that you're great. And everybody laughs. I see that you all Buddhas. And we kind of went, what? A lot of us coming out of encounter groups and stuff are like, what? This is a Buddha? This very body? This very foolish person? And then he kind of smile ironically and go, pretending not to be.
I love that.
And it's like, and he used to later say, and some people are Buddhas pretending to be Buddhas. Like all these group leaders and all. That was a hit to the group leaders. And to a lot of people who become kind of false masters, you can't be a Buddha pretending to be one. You can only be a Buddha. And so, anyway, that became my Zen koan. It was like, okay, I had great resistance to it, 1,000,000 lives worth of seeking the Buddha, but I had to just look at it and see that how can you become something you already are? You can pretend that you are that thing, and you can pretend that you're even more so that you're not that thing. So how did it happen? So meditation is a subjective science. In the Aquarian age, it will finally happen, because this is an age of science, not an age of blind faith and centralization of faith and power grids and everything. The Aquarian age is a decentralization of power, ultimately to the personal sovereignty of individuals. And it's the ultimate humanitarian reality that we are all equally unique. Our uniqueness is what we share. It is not true that we're all created equal. That is patently false. Just look at our different faces. Otherwise we'd all look like Ken and Barbie. And even Ken and Barbie have moved into other forms of late. So that was a first step, a little hint from the Aquarian age, from the 1770s and the Enlightenment. And now we've come to, in the 2020s, which I've called for decades the roaring 2020s. This is the first decade where the Aquarian influence is really kicking in. And it is 150 years from now, when we're fully in the Aquarian age. We're in that twilight period right now of great ages. Two things will end. Faith-based religion will be transformed into knowing, not believing. Belief is doomed in the Aquarian age because it's a qualified ignorance. You either know God or you don't know God. So you either see the godliness inside or you can't see God at all. If God, who else but you needs to be God's eyes and God's voice when he sings, God's tenderness when he makes love and creates things, and God's tears when things happen. We are the mediums of the godliness presence. And it's always available in the eternity of the present moment. So my past started with voice training. I left my operatic career after a few years, shocked everybody, and I started on my path to becoming involuntarily a witness. And then that led to my going to see Osho. So when we were sitting in that row, and he's looking at us in his big chair, and he's looking over, and he looked very lovingly at us and said, "Close your eyes." To each one of us, "Close your eyes, close your eyes." And so I wanted to open my eyes because he was so beautiful, his light and his silence, his emptiness, vast, full of emptiness. And so I'm sitting, I was the second guy in line, so I'm listening to him kind of in the background, talking to the first person getting initiated. I'm kind of like, oh God, I want to open my eyes. I want to drink him in, but I did my best. And then there was a certain point where there was some laughter and some joke or something, and then I just involuntarily opened my eyes, and he's looking at me, and he laughs at me, I laugh at him, and then I close my eyes again. so then I'm sitting there, and there's this long period, and then there's kind of a discomfort, and then there's like almost like an energy that's trying to touch my eyes. Wait, open. And I opened my eyes like this, and I looked, and he's going, come, it's your turn. I went, oh, like that, and I got up, and people laughed. I am a fool. And I got down. So that's why in this picture you see some of the ladies in the background are still kind of coming down from their laugh. They're smiling like over there under his arm. That was his arm. So the laughter was dying down. So I was initiated with laughter. Strangely enough, I was born with laughter. My mother, who also became a disciple, who used to be an MGM dancer, by the way. She was one of those water ballet girls in the famous Esther Williams films.
Wow.
She was the famous scene of all the swan divers way up high. She's the last one to dive in because she was the best diver. And so, yeah, my mother was, and in the Kugat band sequence, she's the lady in the black dyed hair, sliding right up to the camera, screaming. Of course, that was dubbed later. It didn't even sound, my mother doesn't scream like that. Like, oh, anyway. So anyway, she, when I came back from India, she also became a disciple, and her name was Ma Dhyan Vipassana. So we both were Dhyans, which means meditation. Dhyan, my name is Dhyan Arjuna, which means, Osho gave it the meaning, meditation's innocence. He used to say enlightenment is like innocence. Everybody has it. It's when you're born, you're like the fish, or as he'd say in his lisp, the fish. The fish that takes for granted the ocean. How do you know the ocean? You come out of it, you're born from it. It's like the beautiful line in The Way of Water, the Avatar, that beautiful mantra in the water. It's very, very true, very profound, that comes up occasionally in the movie of the Avatar people. And so you could go wondering that you're missing something that's kind of obvious, but you can't see it. And it frustrates you to death, and you kind of have a knowing, you don't understand why you have the knowing that there's something very important that's being missed or misplaced or or lost. And then what happens to you if you're a lucky fish? You get hooked by the USS Ego, or the HMS. We'll call it the HMS Ego. And you're pulled out of the water, and you're going to be eaten by the fisherman's ego. You're going to be eaten, and most people get kind of lost in that, get hooked by identity, but some fish manage to fall through the gunwale back into, my God, this is an ocean. This has all been all around me. I had to lose it to find it. And I think in some strange way, in what is called in India, the great play, the Leela of existence. It's like a great, vast, fathomless, endless ocean that likes to play on its surface all kinds of rising and falling shapes of waves of itself. And the shapes have forgotten. They only see themselves as shapes. They don't see the oceanic just under their surface. They're because they're looking out, they're moving, they're trying to get to that further shore, thinking that's the end of their great passage over the oceanic. And they have forgotten the way that they are ocean. One mystic once said is when you realize your enlightenment, you're a wave, you also have come home to the ocean inside you. And therefore, what happens if this is the same water in every shape? A lot of mystics talk about how there are many infinite, equally unique ways that people come back to remembering their source, but the source in everyone is exactly the same. So anyway, I'm sitting there in front of Osho, and he's speaking to me. He's saying, make only one ambition in your life: to begin meditation. It's funny, I kind of grinned because I'm a very ambitious man. And so he read me right, just transparently. And as he was talking to me, things Also, there were many layers to it. I looked at him and said, my God, and my impression, I didn't say it out loud, but I said, my God, he did die at 21 years old. He's not there. He's not there. There's nobody home. He's emptier than a dead body. And I had gained awareness of dead bodies because I lived on Burning Ghat Road in Pune. And so I went, so whenever the tinkling bells were happening, I used to come out of the house in my orange robes and mala, and I'd go down and watch the burning of someone. And then I would sit for 3 hours watching them burn. Must have been an old tantrika. And then the next day I would watch the skull and look at the darkest of the two eye sockets, and then watch with my eyes half open for 3 hours. And then on the third day, I would come at twilight. And I didn't read about it. I just felt this was what I needed to do. So probably past life memory. I just would then come at twilight and meditate as it went dark at the purified, clean pit. And there was no skull, no body, no guts and fat, nothing. And so I was kind of, and then I kind of was aware of this. Now Osho is like this guy who's really dead, but if that's death, it's more alive than anything I've been in my so-called living life. And so it's a strange paradox. But he was telling me, he says, meditation has two parts. You're needed in the first part. And so all you need to do is begin each moment, begin 24/7. And so he says, you're needed. You just keep preparing your vehicle for the second part, which you have not earned, he said. It comes on its own accord. And when it comes, you will be disappearing, and only the meditation will remain. So in a variation years later, he used to do this beautiful thing where at the end of a discourse, it would all be in white robes and like 3,000 people usually. And he would tell some jokes. He did this deadpan delivery that was just remarkable, and he'd tell some pretty bawdy jokes with this, even way. And then he'd start saying after the end, it's time for our prayers. And then he'd say, there was a Frenchman, an Englishman, and a Jew sitting on the bench. So, and crackers up. And so, like one, he says about people have a misunderstanding. He was doing discourses on the Dhammapada of Buddha, and in 1987, and he made this statement that people have their own understanding. I'll do the cleaner one. He said, there's this Italian who got to go to Rome, a farmer. He'd never been in the city, so he is sitting for lunch, and he notices there's a knife, a spoon, but no fork. He summons over the waitress and say, I want to fuck. He says, well, everybody want to fuck. I said, no, you no understand. I want to fuck on table. You better not fuck on the table. You son of a bitch. People have their own understanding. And of course, Osho was famous for going through all the meanings of that famous Elizabethan word, which is kind of in French like a touche, but it kind of sounds like the literal sound, if you know what I mean. And so, it's the F-U-C-K word. So he would just be saying interrogative. I got today, or aggression. You. And people were literally peeing their pants. They were laughing so loud. And it's very healthy too.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, John, with laughter being such a wonderful medicine.
Well, laughter is one of the most sacred things in our lives, as is tears. You know, it's funny how laughter and tears, I sometimes, as a meditator, I can't tell the difference if somebody's laughing or crying. They're so close. But the
Yeah.
other thing too is it's a classic thing in a joke that every time a person laughs at a good joke, there's an instant where they are home as the Buddha. And all they need to do is observe it. Because, for instance, I'll give you an example. A bride and groom, this is one of my jokes, a bride and groom had just consummated their marriage. And the bride was observing her beloved new husband, who was a very serious man. He was contemplating. He was an existentialist. So he was contemplating what had just happened. I said, how are you doing? Are you feeling okay? He says, well, yes, I can see that you really enjoyed yourself. I'm glad. But I'm not sure. Was it as good for me as it was for you? So it's that gap, that was,
Yeah.
then the laugh. That's you being a Buddha for a moment. So Osho was constantly using jokes, and because there's if one's to be objectively technical about the situation, a joke is where you begin. If we go Monty Python here in a faux documentary, the point is where you're going a certain direction in the story, and then there's a deviation, and in that deviation there's an instant where the mind stops. And that's the moment. That's I often tell people 21 times a day you have a moment where you're enlightened, and because one's not watching, you miss the moment. Happens at least 21 times a day.
I love that, and thank you, John, for sharing that insight into our show as well. I feel very privileged to be able to hear that firsthand, and what I'd really like to do is really speak, like you talked about the 2000s and the present, particularly the last 2 or 3 years, what we've been experiencing, and there's been some major events, and how they come into correlation with Nostradamus and such, and how you feel things are playing out at this current moment in this changing world, these changing times.
Well, this gets me back to the story I put on the shelf about talking to the Russians and introducing 62 million Russians to Edgar Cayce's prophecy about Russia being the hope of the world. And clearly, a lot of people thought it was going to be Gorbachev. Even my own master thought it was Gorbachev. But then when he saw how compromised he was, how naive he was going to dedicate one of his final books on him. Then he rescinded said, no, he's not the guy. So, I mean, you can see where Gorbachev was, in essence, trying to change things. But what he did was let the door wide open to what we would call in America carpetbaggers. After the South was defeated in the Civil War, people came with their bags made of carpets and basically went in to steal the resources and just basically rape and pillage the resources of the South. Now, this is exactly what happened in the 1990s. Russia was turned into it was finally, after Charles XII tried it in 1700, the Northern War tried to take Russia and failed. Then Napoleon in 1812. And then, there was a little variation on a theme in the Crimean War, with Russia trying to destroy Russia or take it apart. And then finally, the worst so far, 1941, Adolf Hitler and his invasion, which killed 27.5 million Russians and Soviet citizens. greatest loss of life of any country. The thing that we do not do in the West is we do not remember the past. We forget it, or we choose to change it to suit our needs. And this idea is still alive and well in the European heritage people, including the Europeans that are like President Biden and those folks who are also of European stock, that it is just a gas station trying to be a country, and why shouldn't we break it up and just pillage all the resources like we almost did in the 90s? And then that little elf, that little house elf suddenly appeared when the big drunk that we kept in there, the Yeltsin, he was a perfect foil for us. We even talk about elections. We even in 1990, in the Time magazine, we said, our man won the election. The man we dumped billions of dollars in. Talk about meddling in other people's affairs and sovereignty. We were proud of it, open with it, but it's criminal. Well, Putin was picked, this little house elf, Dobby, was picked because he was the only man there. He didn't want the job. He did not want to be president. He says, that's why you've got to be president. Because I'm surrounded by even in my family, I've made all these people, these oligarchs, they're going to eat us alive. But we need somebody who is not corrupt, and you're the one. So out of the blue, there's this little guy. And I remember when I saw it, I said, God, who the heck is this guy? He won't last. Well, he did. He managed to get the oligarchs out of politics. He said, you can keep making your money. You made lots of money. Let's stay out of politics. And then one of them didn't. And he made sure the guy went down. Prison, took all his wealth away. I said, guys, I'm not going to bother you, but you're out of politics now. And you're out of selling our resources for a song. So that made him public enemy number one from the GMOs ever since. And because he was a man that actually brought Russia back out of that terrible time where perhaps 10 million of the population died. A lot of the old people didn't get their pensions. They died. There were mass suicides going on. This is coming out now that the tragedy of World War II was almost repeated in the tragedy of the time of troubles of the 1990s. But slowly, he fixed that. And long story short, Russia is now in the prophecies of Nostradamus. There were two great kings, and one was at its peak, he said, in that 1989, quatrain 89. By the way, February, the second month, was when the Soviets left Afghanistan and this whole thing started unraveling. So that's one of the dated ones. And in it, he talked about the great brothers of the North who were not yet brothers. And that and one would be at its peak, the other would later. And that's when I started saying, okay, he's not talking about red flags and stars and hammers and sickles in his prophecies. He's talking about two eagle kings. That means a king, i.e. a president or leader, because he would use the same terminology of the 16th century. That was a common practice of his. These two kings. So it's really a story about two presidents who bear on their presidential seals eagles. The bald eagle of the United States, the two-headed eagle of the Russian presidential flag actually has the two-headed eagle on the tricolor of Russia. Whenever he's in town, that's the flag they raise. We have it on the seal. You see the bald eagle and the 13 stars anytime, and you see the red background heraldry of the double-headed eagle whenever Putin is on a podium speaking. So these are the eagle kings. Question is Biden the eagle king, American king, or somebody who comes after him? The thing that makes it very clear in the prophecies is that Russia will do something that literally is the hope of the world. And what would that hope be? Peace, ability, maybe even though things are very dire in Europe and in the collective West. Conversely, the rest of the world, 2/3 of it, is celebrating Russia. And of course, the news are not going to talk about that. But what I do with algorithms is I see the game that algorithms are. They are there to make you think that you're seeing the world, but the machines are actually narrowing your opinion so everybody agrees with you. And the more you go deep into that Facebook face planting of your perception, you will be so isolated from the world that you might as well be in Fahrenheit 451 watching those big screens. I mean, Bradbury, who was my mentor when I started writing, I bumped into him one day in the library, and he read some of my early stuff. And that's another story I'll tell at a later time. But he was also, I think his dystopian idea was closer to the reality. People are entertained to be kind of dumb and nulled out, and they're becoming illiterate, and so they cannot critically think anymore, and it's done on purpose. So the hope of the world is that now the US dollar is not being used as a weapon against most of the world. In the next 2 years, sorry, when Saudi Arabia pulled out of backing the US dollar, that was the most significant event in 500 years, because it literally is shifting the world after 500 years of Western domination back to its old Eurasian, African center of things happening in the world. And, usually Europe and the West, the Western Hemisphere, are usually backwaters or off the main path of human history. But for 500 years, Europe was suddenly making all the power and trying to turn the world into a giant colony. And so things are happening that are not being reported. For instance, what's happening in Niger is another significant event. And just a few days ago, Macron has decided to abandon Niger as asked by the Nigerian new government. What's scaring people in the West is all these coups that happened in Mali, happened in Burkina Faso, and now in Niger, and now in Gabon, are all popular coups against European meddling. The colonial shadow of colonial control is definitely dominating ECOWAS, and then these three nations left ECOWAS. So it looks like people are staying up, and that war might not happen. So you have the BRICS rising, which I've been a long proponent of the BRICS for 10 years. When they were just a debate club, I said, no, this is one of those things where I see several things developing in the future. I said, that has legs. And I said that as far back as 2010. Watch the BRICS. That is an answer to the US dollar hegemony. And when the BRICS rise, the US hegemon will collapse as quickly as the Soviet Union did. And that will be actually a blessing for America. I think America is very unnatural for America to be a Pax Americana, because it ends up being a Pax Americana upon the world. And the world has finally got an alternative. And as soon as it started developing, they were out of those US banks. They were getting off the dollar, because what triggered it was this idiotic sanction, the first sanction they threw at Russia, where they froze the Russian central bank of $500 billion estimated of foreign currency reserves. And now they're trying to find an excuse to call it legal. It's a bank robbery. And the EU, Ursula von der Crazy and all those people, Joseph of the Jungle Borrell and all of that are, he's the man who famously said, Europe is the West. Outside of Europe, everything's a jungle. And, it's kind of this quasi-racist overview of how, the little brown people, Milwaukee people, really, we are still here to help. We are indeed enlightened. Our doo-doo doesn't stink. And then I answer, of all the continents that have seen more blood soak its lands, the bloodiest is Europe. I've done a study of it. The Europeans have fought more wars and killed more people, mostly themselves and each other, than any other group in history. It's like a pillar way up there and everybody else is down here. So Europe is the jungle, pretending to be the city on shining on the hill. And that's the way it is. And so what is, the Nord Stream bombing was a greater terrorist act than 9/11. It was the United States that did it. Seymour Hersh is onto something, and in my writings at Hogue Prophecy Report, I show all of that and the details and the sources. So Russia is the hope of the world because it's changing the world with the help of China and India, the three major players in this new shift of a more multipolar world, which is attempting to actually allow people to evolve their concepts of democracy according to their own needs and understandings of it. America has risen as this puritanical preacher, judging people and saying, you've got to do it this way. And if you don't, we'll take your money away and we'll shut down your economy. You've got to be American like us. I mean, the Pax Americana has been basically a projection of American isolationism, where there's isolationism in any empire, but we literally can go to the other side of the world, look a person physically face to face, and we will project, this is how Japanese should behave. This is how Russians should behave. And it's unique. Our need to isolate our perception of the world and not stand in the shoes of others is destroying rapidly this empire. It has clay economic feet now. It cannot spendthrift anymore. It'll have to pay and buy and sell within its means. And after perhaps a similar period of trouble, at least it won't have Russia coming in with its carpetbaggers, because Russia's just interested in its sphere of influence, as is the Chinese. They're not, we project again they've got to be wanting to do what we're doing.
Definitely.
And that's the way Americans think now. And this all started because every war America's been in, including the First World War, when it was over, we always went back to a peace economy. We dismantled our army, to some small size, and we just went back to peaceful business, that's American. But what happened at the end of World War II, the Depression was ended by Lend-Lease and our preparation. We were already prepared ourselves in the late 30s to become very quickly the arsenal of democracy and just produce, because in that day, we were the number one economy. We were the emerging China. And so when the war ended, it rapidly descended into uncharted waters. Rather than people going back to just peaceful commerce, the Cold War started. And some people got, after 45 years, a few generations of people who were in the business of fighting the Cold War got the war addiction. The daddy warbucks war addiction. War was great business. And the shock they had in 1990 when the first Cold War ended was, my God, peace happened. What a tragedy. We lost money. We lost profits. We have to find another. We got these neocon guys. They're writing all these ideas about how we could find another business model, like the war on terror. It's like the war on hemorrhoids or something. It's so like open wide of what kind of terror, who. Oh well, and then within weeks, George Bush, not a very sharp blade in the cupboard, was already saying it'll last 35 years. How does he know that? He's no Nostradamus, and so, well, it's because it's all planned. And it came, Leslie Clark was briefed and then told the world that there was this whole plan to take down all these countries that had one thing in common. They wanted to get off the US dollar, and they were mostly oil based. Well, now it's happened. The biggest oil dollar guy left, and now they're all gone. The Chinese came in and helped the Saudi Arabians and Iran and their quarrels. I mean, there's things happening in the Middle East that are very hopeful. I mean, the Syrian war and Yemen war is probably going to end. The Chinese are being great negotiators of let's just have a world that's stable. How can anything good come from a world that's so unstabilized by the U.S. constantly taking people down and perpetuating their addiction of war unto trying to get the old business model back, a second Cold War in 2014, when Victoria Nuland, the famous, now second in command of the State Department, back then she was a deputy Secretary of State, she was told by Obama to pick after a violent fascist coup in the Maidan Square, to pick the next government, which was the basis. And what was overthrown was the last democratically elected president of Ukraine. His government was thrown out violently by right sector, Pratley sector, which is old school Nazi. I don't call them neo-Nazis. These are Stefan Bandera-rights. These are the people which just famously happened in Canada a few nights ago, where this hero who was supposed to be fighting the Soviets got 2 standing ovations, and they didn't know, or they did, but they didn't think anybody'd care. Because I would say Ukraine not only has a Nazi problem, Canada has a Nazi problem. And I know this firsthand from the death threats I got from reporting on the Maidan Square and showing the torchlight parades and all the stuff that's real old school Nazi. And I saw, why am I getting all these Facebook people threatening me? And they all seem, so I went into each one of their Facebook pages and I started to see a pattern. They all live around Toronto. And they're all kind of, well, rather white supremacist, right-wing kind of people. And then I found out that when the Galicia division surrendered to the British in Italy at the end of 1940 of the war, the few thousand that survived, they were all allowed to go to Canada and not face criminal trials, because the Galicia division is one of the worst Waffen-SS divisions of the Waffen-SS. They did some fighting, but most of what they were doing, and I've seen the pictures of it, the Galicia division was murdering civilians, Jews, ethnic Russians, Ukrainians who believe in communism. They were cut out to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And they were some of the worst of the Nazis of the past. And, you know, I tell people, notice something, a pattern here. The last time Nazis gained power in a European nation was in 1933. And a few years after that, there was a Second World War that killed 60 million people. Not since that time have Nazis taken a major European nation over power. It happened in Ukraine in 2014. And now we have a new Cold War, and we have the threat of World War III. This is what Nazis do. They're Death Eaters. They are anti-life. They are, and we are just like the people in the 1930s. We're kind of going, oh yeah, I don't like those symbols and stuff, but they're okay, they're fine. Oh yeah, that old 98-year-old guy. Okay, let's applaud. We don't know where his bayonet went or what he did to Jews or things like that. He probably did something, because you know their children, their grandchildren were going after me, and I think I'm one of the early people on that peacemaker list.
So, John, I was just going to ask you, what will the future look like with Ukraine then, and with Russia? And you talked about you said the fall of America, and how will that look like in the world? So, in the next, let's say, you know, the people listening to the podcast, what's going to be happening in the next 5 years? Do you feel in the world, if that makes sense?
Yes, I'm getting to that. I'm a little long-winded, but it's a big issue. Well, first off, America in the next 2 years, by the astrologically speaking, the real tough times in the 2020s is the first half. And then as Pluto moves out of this long orbital American era from 1776 to its original birth position, it's in there now. So it's taken around 248 years. And this has been, I call it the American era, because Pluto rules, Nostradamus' main skill was being a judicial astrologer, which we call political or mundane astrologer now. This is what I do also in his work, is to read the destinies of nations, peoples, leaders. And a lot of things that in the 2010s and the 2020s were causing oppositions and squares with Pluto and other big planets like Uranus, that all starts becoming trines in the second half of the 2020s. But what that means is, in general, is that now when Pluto moves into approaching its position in Aquarius that it had during the French Revolution, which will be an exactitude around the mid-2030s, you're going to see a variation on the same theme: revolution. The people rising and questioning power centers of the world. All this, what happens in this Plutonic cycle is when America was born, that was when Western aristocracies were at their peak. And like today, they were fighting with each other and all, but these were the mafia powers of the time. And all dressed and perfumed and Versailles and all of that and other places. And as they reached their peak, they did so because of a new phenomenon that had not really burst into the world, which was bursting in Europe, France, and the British colonies in America: a middle class. Now, middle classes are good at creating wealth, and the aristocracy loved that because they took most of it, just like they're doing now in the current corporate aristocracy that is happening, to the point where, over an issue of taxation, which the people in America thought was too much for the French Indian Wars, it led to blows and led to a revolution. Well, just look at the polls of what people feel like in Germany and in France and in Poland now. I don't know if the Law and Justice Party is going to win in October, because now the polls are in full retreat from their 6 months ago. They wanted to make Western Ukraine, part of Poland, and reunite the Lithuanian Polish empires of glorious past, which is not happening. So anyway, so what happens is, now 248 years later, we have a new aristocracy. I always said it would be from that aristocracy, fascism would really become what Mussolini defined it as: corporate. That was really what Mussolini wanted to call fascism. It's another word for corporate. And now it is corporate. And there are some people like Schwab and other people who are probably clowns on the point, making propaganda for the real people. But the idea is control the world as a global state. 20 years ago, I was writing about the dark side of Aquarius. That's exactly how a dying Piscean age, with its dwindling power centers, its elites would try to do, is they would try to make the whole world a police state with a smile, through media, through dumbing people down. And that's happened. And I said the 2020s, that's when fascism would emerge again, with the same dangers of the 1930s and 40s. It happened. It's all in my books back then, from far back as 1990 and late 80s. So it has happened, and we are now faced with a new world war. I would say it's already on in its conventional phase, and hopefully will not go to nuclear. So a couple things now. there's a lot of talk about freezing this conflict like the Korean War. It will not happen. It's funny how Blinken and all these people that are all the allies of the West are all very satisfied in making an idea, but guess what? They never asked the Russians are on board. And the Russians are sitting there very patient and stoically, very clearly saying, we're not going to stop. There's not going to be a frozen conflict. There's two options for Ukraine, and it's necessary denazification. They see, because they have the pain of 27 million dead from Nazis, and they've seen the same pattern in the past being repeated. This is the next great European attempt to take over Russia. And frankly, guess who just admitted last week that's exactly what happened? Jens Stoltenberg, the General Secretary of NATO, openly admitted to it that the encroachment, the promise broken, and the encroachment since the 90s of NATO and its expansion to the Russian borders, adding another 1,200 kilometers of Finland just recently, is directly a threat in the name of peace. Just like all those millions of Germans maneuvering Eastern Europe. Why are they all there? No, it's all peaceful. No. NATO is not a defensive organization. Tell that to Serbia. Tell that to Libya. They cannot exist unless the biggest mistake that happened when the Cold War ended is NATO should have dissolved, as well as the Warsaw Pact. But
Absolutely.
NATO, and now I've just found information that I've corroborated that the plan was already, when Baker was saying not one step further east, the plan was already being developed to vastly expand NATO to the Russian border with the aim of breaking it up. So, when people say, oh, well, let's keep in this goal until Putin is overthrown and the Russian government is overthrown, do you people understand that that's a nuclear superpower, several thousand nukes bigger than the United States? And if it goes into chaos, or if they see the decapitation coming of their government, you will trigger what the Israelis have long ago called the Samson option. Now, biblical story. Samson, with his power of his hair, Delilah, when he was asleep, cut all his hair off. And then the Philistines captured him, blinded him, gouged his eyes out. And they just tied this strong man to two load-bearing pillars of the temple. And all the elites of the Philistines were all getting drunk and laughing and spraying their wine on him. And then the story is that Samson prayed to God, said, God, I have been a sinner and I've done this. Give me one last strength, and I will pull these pillars down upon myself and take mine enemies with me. So the point is that Samson option was if 200 million Arabs and maybe another 100 million Persians were successfully overwhelming little Israel, then Israel, with its nuclear weapons, had openly threatened that if we go down, if we are losing a war, we will unleash 200 nukes on all of you Arabs and Persians. And like a scene out of the book of Revelations, you are all wiped out. That was their threat. And so what is now not what I'm seeing developing is that the evolution, the forgetting in the West of what nuclear war is. I lived through the last Cold War. And if you were like the same John Stoltenberg last year and in 2021 was openly musing about using a tactical nuke and believing, oh, we drop a tactical nuke on a group of Russians getting ready for an invasion, and that'll end it all. That's what he'd like to think. But the nuclear doctrine of the United States has always been first strike. And we proved it. We blew up Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the doctrine in my books, I actually show the evolution with each president of how the nuclear doctrine has changed. Now we reserve the right to nuke a non-nuclear country. Nobody talks about that in the mainstream press. But we are, and the person who did most of the threat is Barack Obama. I mean, this is the man, most people, because he's so charming and all, this is the man who every Tuesday used to list Americans and other people with very little intel, for drone assassination across Africa and Central Asia, to the tune of 18,000 people being killed as collateral damage. And there's no constitutional right for him to do that, because Congress has not declared war since World War II on anybody. And so he got around it. That's how Truman got around it with the police action in Korea. And ever since then, no president and no Congress has stood up and said, wait a minute, we are the other counterbalancing power to the executive and the justice. And we say, you don't start a war unless we agree to it, because we represent the people. Well, not anymore. So the danger is that that at some point now in the next few months, the Ukrainian army is going to collapse. It is in any war of attrition, when the collapse happens, like it did to the Army of Northern Virginia in 1865 in the American Civil War against the Union forces, which kept, because they had the men to do it, they kept thinning out the line. The Russians are doing that right now. And the Ukrainians have just, in the Battle of Bakhmut, they lost 100,000 casualties. And now they go from that disaster to another at 4th June, since 4th June, where right now it's not official, but just given what I'm seeing daily on the battlefields, I would say that they're clearing 80,000 casualties. And they started with a reserve of 60,000. So that's their Battle of the Bulge last strategic reserve. And the Russians, on the other hand, are 1,000 men a day are volunteering. They didn't have to call up a second major call up. They got 400,000 people from volunteers. So they have their second echelon for the next big push. And this, if your goal in your special military operation is to take out the Nazis, well, you have to do what we in the end of the Lats nasty problem had to do. We had to stay there for years and be part of this denazification thing for at least 6-10 years. Well, they're planning for that. They're planning to fight this war or be at a level of advanced preparation for the bigger picture, what's coming next with China and that in America. By 2025, they plan to still fight this war if it's happening, but I don't think it's going to be happening much longer, or it's going to change a lot, because what's clearly showing up now is the politicians in Ukraine are probably going to collapse first. And that will then bring confusion in the armies. The Russians have grown their forces in Ukraine from 200,000 at the beginning to nearly 800,000 ready, 300,000 of these ready to do major offensive pushes. It'll be a steamroller. They're not going to go fast, because why should they? The Ukrainians are just coming in to be killed, and they're brave men, but they're terribly led. I mean, they're brother Slavs like the Russians, who are great fighters, and the fighting is vicious, but they have NATO criminally and the United States criminally force men to learn skills that take years, and just gave them a couple months. It's, I saw that when I saw to what extent that was happening, it was easy for me to say, well, this is going to be a massacre, because they know enough to get in more trouble. Then it got to a point for the last month where they were just doing human waves, the Ukrainians, because they don't have, and they're dumped off by their armor, and then they all run out into the open Ukrainian steppe. And because the Ukrainians started using cluster bombs years ago, I mean, this war has been going on for 9 years, folks. It started in 2014. It just got into this international phase in the last year and a half. But I have been broadcasting and showing, especially people like war correspondent like Patrick Lancaster and others that live in Donbass all these years, seeing the daily terror bombings for 9 years of Donetsk city. This is all happening. When the Ukrainians get a lot of shells, the Nazis in them say, well, keep the eugenics war going. So this, I'm telling you something very radical from what most people in England are hearing, because even in America, there's a little more skepticism about this war. But in Britain, when I look at British TV and when I look at radio and stuff, and France and Germany, it's starting to break this kind of, oh yes, oh, they blew up our pipeline. Oh well, they're our friends, aren't they? Let's just pretend it didn't happen and march, take our Taurus missiles and our storm shadows and maybe some attackums and give them all, and just everything will be all right, won't it? It isn't all right. In fact, you're going to see. So one thing you're going to see in the next years or so, you're going to see the fall of Macron. You're going to see the fall of EU, the breakup of the EU, the breakup of NATO. Is all going to happen in the next 5 years. And
what are your thoughts, John, on sorry to interrupt there. I just wanted to know your thoughts as well on Donald Trump over speaking on these world leaders.
Well, Donald Trump is an interesting character. When he first came down that escalator and in 2015, I looked at his astrology, and within 15 minutes, I realized I had to write an entire book about it, because the man's astrology is full of surprises. So I wrote it. Like, it was called Trump for President, an Astrological Assessment. It's the most accurate book I've ever written. And I didn't pull punches, but I didn't hide praise either. I was fair. And knowing his astrology, I wrote it as if it was going to be a hard session with an astrologer that was going to hit you hard, but also point out your potential good sides. And knowing his chart, he would respect that, because the thing that pushes his buttons more than anything else is not being hit, but not fairly. Well, in his view of what fair is. Now, if he's elected president, then I will be able to complete my book trilogy on Trump. But I can see it more as a book for, not so much for Trump, that one, but for how do you use this wide open unconscious channel who has Gemini Sun, Uranus conjoined it, and the North Node of luck. And all of that is squared the Pluto in Virgo, I believe, of the US birth chart. So he lives and dies by boom bust economic cycles. That, long story short, that's what that means.
Yeah.
He is the third president in a row since this century started to have the affliction of Neptune square his sun. Bush had it, and that's why it is a sign of self-delusion. When you are, now, if you are very watchful and a meditator, it can be the sign of a great channel because you're aware of the dangers of projection. But if you don't have that supported in the rest of your chart, you'll be somebody who said, well, I've listened to a higher father than my own father, the former president. God told me to strike the Iraqis, and I did. God told me to hit these people, and I did. Of course, he does not look and assess that it's a disaster, all of it. But he's in a self-delusion with his channeling of God. He's channeling his ego, not God. Now, Obama has it too, but he had a little more help from other astrology. But the way his delusion worked was kind of taking his sexuality into politics. He couldn't, it's like, I'm going to win the impossible woman to win. Well, he did with his wife. So that was fulfilled. But what often happens with people who are always trying to win the impossible is once they've achieved it, the thrill is gone, and they kick the goal to the side and start looking again. So he's elected president. he goes to all the Republican leaders in media and in the politics and has a dinner with them. And in 20 minutes, they made it very clear to him that they don't want the black man in the White House, that they will do everything they can to make sure his changes never happen, and that he'll be voted out in 4 years.
Yeah.
And in 2 years, he'll lose his control of the House and the Senate. So they laid it out. Now, when Trump said similarly open source stuff about the oil that America is taking out of Syria, the very sage president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, said, "It is always good to have a transparent enemy." That's a man who, knows how to lead. I'm not saying I'm with his politics or not, but he knows he's not some babe in the woods like so many Americans are, babes in the woods with nukes.
Yeah.
And so Obama had that opportunity handed to him by his enemies. And he could have said, well, if he didn't have Neptune square sun, he would have said, well, thank you, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to have a transparent enemy. Now I'll get to work and get very public with this, and I'll overturn you guys in 2 years. And I will be talking daily about what you said today. And since I kind of control the liberal media a lot, you'll be hearing this drumming. It will be drummed until Americans hear it in 2 years. And then we solidify our control of the House and Senate, change the Supreme Court, and we will do to you what you intend to do to me. That's not what he did, though, because he's afflicted. He suddenly got that I'll win them over. Oh, she's saying she's too hard to get, that female elephant of the GOP. I'll win her over, tusks and all. And so he piddled away all of his political capital, which he should have been strengthening by having the House and Senate in his pocket and the executive branch. And he didn't. And so he lost that. He lost all the means to make his dreams happen. He literally chased after that Republican elephant. Into his third year of his second term, did he even have an inkling of what he had done? So that's the delusion of Obama. Now, Trump does not have it in his birth chart. That's fortunate for him. But he has this issue, as does the American people, collectively seen through the astrology of their country. It's like this. He's a man who's married. This is a Mormon marriage that's not going well. He is a man with two wives, the smaller red wife and the bigger blue wife. The blue wife is distracted by her derangement syndrome to an extent that she's literally having a psychotic break. And she's like is mentally ill with it, not really seeing things straight, and just hates him beyond hate, hysterically. The smaller red wife, because it was a smaller vote of the Electoral College, she sits there looking at him and singing, "Stand by your man, do." It's like she's just, whatever he says and does is wonderful. And if it isn't, I'll stand by him anyway. So those are the two delusional halves of the United States with Trump. And Trump has his own view of them, which is also delusional. So that's what happened in the last presidency. We'll have to see what the astrology does, especially with these trines that are coming. I think he's learned a lot from what's happening. This attempt to turn him into the next Lula in prison, like they did in Brazil, is going to have the same outcome. Lula will be back. It's like, but the hysteria in this woke, overcrowded thing that's going on in the Democratic Party, it's even banning a Kennedy. And I might add, Robert Kennedy Jr. really reminds me of his father and his uncle more than any other Kennedy I've seen before. But even he's been a little thick about how the Democrats rig their primary elections very openly. But he finally is getting it. And he's openly saying, don't do this, or I'll go into independent. He'll play the Ross Perot card in 1992, and that will make sure that Trump, if he's, you see, you can't, they're trying to do a thing where he can't even run. They're trying to get him on treason. These trials are ridiculous. And it'll probably go into the Supreme Court. And even if they put him in jail for one of them, he'll still be president. So it's very likely that Trump could win, or as Tucker Carlson implied, and it is a possibility, assassination. You know, I remember saying when we were winning all of our legal battles in Oregon, on the Oregon Commune, and I kept saying, you know, it reminds me of Martin Luther King. He keeps winning. He keeps winning the civil rights movement to the point when they can't get him legally, they'll probably kill him. And because I saw it, and then I said, I think they're going to do that to Osho. He keeps winning, then it'll go to Plan B. Well, he was poisoned in prison. They said he was fleeing a secret indictment. How can you flee a secret indictment if it's secret? Now, you can, in an immigration issue, if you flee the country, that makes it very hard for you to get back in the country. That's the worst thing that happens. But if it's an indictment that's secret, you cannot be fleeing from it. No. And so without a warrant that was signed, until it was signed a few weeks later, he was stopped in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then he went for 12 days being moved around the prison system in an attempt to have his legal people lose him. And he was lost to us for 3 days. He ended up out of the federal system, hiding in the Oklahoma County jail, which is actually where Silkwood met her end for her whistleblowing on nuclear disasters in America. So it's the same area. And he was given, first they put him in a cell. And of course, all his prisoners knew he was. You know, people forget that in 1984 and 85, on the mainstream news in the United States, we were on for at least 5 to 10 minutes every day. The whole world was talking about us then. Now they're all trying, oh, no, that never happened. No. I mean, it was quite amazing. We were all on TV all over the world. And so everybody in the prison, mostly Black people and Hispanics, they all loved Osho, and they were like, oh my God, Osho's here. And they started helping him. And one of them was a man dying of terminal herpes, which was the first cell they put him in with. And he said, oh, Osho, Bhagwan, it's great to see you, but I got to tell you, you got to stay as far away from me as you can. I'm dying of herpes. They want you to get this. So you keep pounding on that door until they get you out. And they did, and they put him in another cell. And then then this guy came in with a really ugly mattress, had no mattress. And the guy came in and he's literally like a hot potato. He wants to throw it and get it in. Now Osho, it smelled and all. So he decided, I'll just roll it up. So I'll sleep on the floor with my head making it a pillow. Now, a few years later, he had all this weird stuff happening to his ear and stuff, which looked like some kind of radiological thing. So we think that luckily for him, he had rolled it in a way that the isotope was far away from his head, but not right next to it. Because then they go, oh, he died of a stroke. Well, that happens, you know. And then when they rolled that out, this guy was much happier, and he gave him a piece of bread with some sauce on it, and Osho bit into it, and it tasted metallic. It was weird. So he stopped eating. And finally, what happened is one of the Black women who was incarcerated, she managed to find the legal team and said, no, he's in Oklahoma. I just saw him. And then we were back again. So they had to stop all that. But in that sandwich, from what happened in the next 4 years, where he aged 20 years in 4, and his head hair started falling out in the back, but not his beard, but he started to show all the signs of thallium poisoning, heavy metal poisoning. It's the assassination poison of choice of the CIA. And it is, you know, what it does is does most of its damage. And the damage it does is if you've got health conditions, it makes them worse. So it's perfect. deniability. Oh, he had heart disease. He was a diabetic. He died of that. Nobody poisoned him. Well, there were enough signs. We could not find it because that's usually what happens. It gets out of the body. And so it is very likely that any person, I'm on a hit list. Any person who says a heterodoxical view of the world is threatening, especially in this day and age where fascism has returned. So this war, when the collapse comes either politically or militarily or both, that is going to cause a very rapid advance of the Russians, who are, I've looked at what they've been saying. The only way, even Putin says we don't want to, but the only way we're going to denazify Ukraine is to go all the way and take all of it. They have been saying this. They're saying, we can't stamp out Nazism unless we do that. So their aim is that they'll either get a negotiation upon their terms with the Ukrainians, and if they can't get that, Ukraine will disappear. It will disappear as a nation. They're dead serious about this Nazi thing. We would be too if we lost 27 million people, and it may be worse this time, because if they go after a decapitation of Russia, the Russians will use their nuclear weaponry, and we will have World War III. Europe will disappear in 10 minutes, America in 30. So we're really at the most dangerous point of our civilization right now, and at levels of magnitude way beyond what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because in that instance, both sides were rational. Both sides immediately saw their mistakes and started to backtrack this thing before it went nuclear. What makes it so dangerous is that I wrote a book back in the beginning of what I call the Second Cold War in April of 2014, called A New Cold War, the Prophecies of Nostradamus, Stormberger, and Edgar Cayce. And there were some others. And what I did is a control group of people who were very good at predicting World War I and II. Dates, Stormberger was remarkable, and others all the way back in medieval times. And ironically, a majority of them were Germans, which is kind of interesting. It was almost like a quantum filament experience, where a quanta in what would be called the past was trying to observe the future quanta and make it change. So that I wrote that in there too. So of course it was unsuccessful, but so they also, except for Edgar Cayce, they also, all the others, talked about a third world war. And Stormberger was the most chilling. Some of them said one was where people will hurl stars from the sky, fusion, on cities and destroy them. Stormberger said in one day, more people would die than all the world's wars put together. But the most chilling thing he said, which has really got me risking my life even just to talk about it and make people aware of these prophecies, is he said in the third World War, they would walk in with their eyes wide open. These people that Nostradamus called the leaders of the West are preparing a great war around the time of a great pestilence. Well, we had that, COVID. And they have been preparing this. They've been preparing this thing since 1990. It's finally coming out. Stoltenberg's even starting to admit it. Yes, we wanted you to go to war in Ukraine so that we could destroy you and overthrow Putin. And they're openly saying it now. The Russians aren't going to talk to people like that. I wouldn't talk to people like that. Oh, we're going to come in and we're going to raise your house and kill you. And so, for them to succeed in their goal, which most people in America ape like monkeys, like, oh, we're going to destroy Russia. Well, what do you think happens if the Russian leadership sees, as per their doctrine, they will release 3,000, 4,000 ICBMs. And the other thing is that the Russians are 10 years ahead of the West in hypersonic missile technology. The Sarmad 2 is operational, by the way, the one that can pass within 20 minutes around the world under the South Pole and come up behind all the radars of the United States in 20 minutes at Mach 12. And it can hold 10 MIRVed hypersonic nukes that also go that fast inside it, smaller. And I sometimes just writing something now because I'm wondering what happens if Stoltenberg drops a nuke to stop the advance of Russians towards Poland. What will the Russians do? Now, you know, people, good sources of mine, actually him for 20 years, Scott Ritter, former Marine major in military intelligence, really good. He thinks that, well, Russia will just, if one nuke is launched, Russia will just launch everything. I hope he's wrong. I think, given my study of Putin, it's many years, his astrology intimately, he's a measured, balanced man. The way he's depicted in the West is ridiculous. All Western people need to do is what I do. Spend the last few years listening to his speeches without editorial news stuff. You will immediately find that he's a very measured, intelligent man. I would even say he's the most significant leader alive today in the world. And if he's the king, eagle king of Russia, that is the hope of the world, then it'll be Putin that actually prevents, with a measured response, what this is. And so I came up with this scenario. It just came to my head, and I don't know, I hope it doesn't happen, but the scenario I had is that since the Sarmats are all ready, he can say, okay, our response will be conventional, but our response will be conventional in a certain way. We're going to tell you exactly what we're going to hit. We're going to tell you early, so you have 5 to 10 minutes to get all of your people in their bunkers in every NATO air base in the worst, in the most aggressive people fighting with us proxy through Ukraine. Great Britain, France, Germany, and any US bases in NATO in Europe. In 5 minutes, we will launch our Sarmats, and they, with conventional weapons, will put a giant crater in every one of your airfields so that you can't land or take off. And we'll do it in 10 minutes. We need to show you, without going nuclear, that even conventionally, our systems are way advanced. Let's talk, or else we're all dying. So that's kind of a scenario that I have in my view. And it may be variations of it. Maybe it's just one field, but you know, they will be, we're so confident about our advanced technology that we'll tell you exactly when and what we're going to hit. We're not going to surprise you at all. We're going to make a demonstration that we hope will end the madness in your capitals, and really understand how close to the edge we have come. So whether that happens or not, I don't know. But that's, I think it will be measured. I do feel that we will go a step beyond what we did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I do feel there's going to be something. It's and maybe, because, you know, this is the other thing. The people of Europe are against this. And
Absolutely.
Absolutely against it. Look what's happening to I mean, this pipeline attack has, even though Britain does not get its gas directly, it gets it from Europe, and it's like and now the Americans say, oh, well, you can buy LNG, which they don't have. They need another 300 tankers to really make it work, and Europe only has 2 ports, little ports. It takes 10 years to get LNG, and it's 4 times more expensive. And now Germany is in deep recession. It will go into a depression this winter. This is an El Nino pattern that's coming up in our climate, which means that it could last at least 3 years, like right around 2010. And also, I started looking at the history of what it did. Remember those big blizzard winters that you had in England?
Yeah.
Back then, that's El Nino's winter. And what it did when I was watching the fighting in the Donbass Civil War is I remarked about, wow, if this was World War II, there'd be snowdrifts in Ukraine, with the Germans fighting the Soviets. They were just dusted with snow, but they were as cold. A dry, very cold and lingering winter, early November. I mean, the Russians, I think, can roll off their winter offensive at the beginning of November, not long from here, because the ground will be frozen, and their tanks will be rolling free. And so all that's going to start happening, which gets us to that Samson option moment. Either the Russians feel that the Americans are going to do something to them, they launch, or the Americans who for the last 32 years don't even know what losing is. These leaders, I mean, literally they can't seem to. It's inconceivable for them. So are they that stupid that they'll say, well, we'll launch even though America is not directly involved? Yeah, I mean, America loses a war big, but America's fine. Their political careers are over, but America's fine. But America may just launch because they cannot conceive of losing.
Yeah,
that's how crazy it is here. It's really crazy here.
Just want to sort of thank you for that sort of insight you share. Continue to share with us, John. Really interesting to sit back and listen here. But I just wanted to touch on something there that recently, and maybe many of our listeners who are listening in and watching, I'm sure they're finding this episode very interesting as well. May have watched the Wild Wild Country documentary with Osho. Now, I'd love to hear your opinion.
Yes. Well, my opinion is it's you see, in my little village, everybody knows me, and when that came out, people were constantly stopping me and asking questions, because the people who created that, you can often, it's a study in how the people who came to do a video about us in Netflix clearly came in with their blinders on. The only person they could deal with was Ma Anand Sheela. Now, I know Ma Anand Sheela. I know all the people who were guests. I lived there. I was in security for some of that and other jobs. And actually, I think it's me with my red cowboy hat in the background during the celebrations. I was with the band. I was part of the singers, soloists in the background. So I think I'm in that, or you're actually hearing my voice if you're hearing any of the celebration music. But Sonny and all those people, I know them all. And Naren, he just lives on the opposite side of the Puget Sound. And Mutribo is the source. He was our videographer. He's the source of all that incredible footage. And when he saw it, his first impact was, where did they find all my beautiful shots of everybody? And it was from an archive in Oregon that they got it. What happened is, they gave Osho maybe 5 minutes. We were always these beautiful, happy, alive people in this beautiful city that we built as a backdrop to this stupid ego-driven story of Ma Anand Sheela and her abuse of power. I mean, this would be like if you did a documentary on Jesus, a 6-part documentary on Jesus, and all you did was follow Judas around here or there, or when he got the coins, or and like all that's, even the crucifixion is way off in the distance. And the people watching are going, but wait a minute, what about that guy? What about those disciples? What about what happened to him? And so I was getting that when all these people saying, man, I wanted to know more about what was going on. They never kind of got to how you people lived. What did you do? You were just like rendered in the background, and this boring Sheila and her crimes was their whole trip. And then they went off. They promised to do another one, and then they went off, because a lot of the people filming it, the sannyasins, the disciples of Osho, are saying, you're really missing the story, the day-to-day miracles of living here. Why don't you just do some of that too, not just Manan Sheila? Look at the other. Look at Luke. Well, Luke wasn't there. Matthew and Peter, and the female disciple that nobody talks about much, who is probably Jesus's wife, because in Hebrew society, you have to be you have to have a family for people to respect you. You can't just be some guy, not with a wife and children and stuff like that. So that got lost in the translation. So anyway, so what it did, that without it wanting to, that series brought a whole new generation of people into interest around the world about Osho. And it reminds me of something when I worked in the press office when we all returned back to Pune in the late 80s. And I worked with the press office. I was working with Hasya, who was also in that show a lot. And Hasya was heading our media, and I was part of it. And so she would go every night to Osho's room, and we would prepare stuff for him to look at, and then he'd give his decisions and stuff. So we were working at that time on the Indian Independent, was doing this horrible, the usual old story, the usual cliches and the usual ignorance. But there was a nice picture of Osho. So she went in with that, and then she'd come in back in the office, and some of us would be there in the office, and she'd tell us what Osho said. So it often happened like this. She said, well, I showed him the ghastly stuff they were saying. He was sitting going, good. And then what he would say at the end, was there a picture of me? And she said, yes, Osho, there was. Was it a good picture of me? Yes, Osho, it was beautiful. And he'd go, good. The power of the Murti. Osho really understood that. That's why before this new religion started in Pune, I mean, we're getting, it's wonderful to see, in a way, to see how religions are created by the people who love the master most, but are still in their ego. And so, in Pune, there's the exact same thing happening in our world that happened in all the other disciples of other great masters, the separation of the exoterics from the esoterics. The exoteric, and there's, in my community, there's in Facebook and other places, this huge debate going on, but I keep coming in being kind of a buzzkill, and then I get crickets after I say it, and the argument ends. They don't want to be around me. I say, you all, in that passage from Ancient Music of the Pines, one of Osho's 700 books, you are missing the most important three words at the beginning. He said, I am creating the exoteric and esoteric in my community. I am creating it. So everybody forgets that, and they say, well, we're the esoterics. No, we're the exoterics. We're the good people. They're the bad people. He's created it. So what the question really to ask is, why? Why does it happen? And he kind of says unavoidable. As I understood it, he said it's unavoidable, so I created. Now, it's interesting because they both have their use. The exoterics are the reason why we have scriptures left of Buddha. And, they are the people who preserve the scriptures, they preserve the temples. And in that regard, even though the price is creating religions, they also, that kind of become power issues, political issues in the name of God or moksha or nirvana. And they end up, but they have a role of perpetuating the teaching for millions of people that come in the future. The esoterics live it. But that becomes a nuisance because Osho is a very spontaneous person, not a control freak. And so eventually what happens, one after the other, they all get banned and thrown out. Well, what's good about that? They are out in the world doing their thing, not hiding at home in the ashram. So that's my take on it. But there's a third thing that I think is happening here, because Osho was not just a break with Enlightenment's traditions of the past. It's a complete break, but it has some similarities, but a different way of looking at things. My sense is that in the future, disciples of masters will be both. I have a library of Osho's books. That's me being an exoteric. And before I die, I will give it to somebody else, so that the faith is preserved. That's my exoteric side. I'm also an esoteric. I'm living it. I don't see why both can't be in balance. And with Osho is what he didn't say. That is usually the answer. And if he saw that you got it, he would stop in mid-sentence. And people say, why did you just stop? I see you already got the message between my lines. Why should I talk any further? You got the message. So I will be writing about that as well. But it is here's an important thing, that what's going on in the world is not a thing separate from the world. Even the fear of nuclear war has its alchemical use. I live life alchemically. Whatever life throws at me, I turn the base metal of it into gold. So the one thing it's helping me do in the dialogue is do what innocent children do. It mostly gets shut up. And that is, since Arjuna means innocence, in this case, I ask those innocent questions like, but why should we survive? How nice have we been to planet Earth? All these wars and stuff. What maybe this classroom is coming to its end. And maybe it's how we live, like the Zen people say. There's this wonderful quote: walking in Zen, sitting in Zen. This peace is constant, no matter what is happening, even when the samurai sword is unsheathed in your direction, you are smiling in peace. So the Japanese Zen statement. So even at death, even if someone's going to murder you, you're just watching and blissful. And so that's an element, to just accept the fact. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but if you repress it, it has more chance to happen rather than face it. Osho used to say, whatsoever you're against, go into it. Whatsoever you fear, go into it. Because if you don't, it will follow you like a shadow.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. So say it. Well, maybe this is the end. Let's face that possibility. It's a 50-50. Well, that's a lot. Maybe this is the end. Maybe, or this is what Fermi's paradox couldn't quite grasp, is that because Fermi and even all the rest of us, except for about 20 years ago, we were all saying the question, are we on this solar system a freak solar system that has planets? And do all the other stars have planets? Or maybe we're a freak, just on an accident. Now we're saying, is it even possible for any star in the universe not to have at least 8-10 planets? A lot of them in the Goldilocks zone. And then add further the studies that have shown that being a binary planet with a very large moon, for the size of our planet, because it was born by a Mars-sized rock hitting probably what the Pacific Ocean was way back in the Precambrian era or something, and it created the moon out of its parts that started debris rolling around. It became a moon and mixed a little bit with Earth and all that. Well, it created a binary planet, which has an axis shifting, which has seasons, which has tides. And many have said, scientists theorize that if it wasn't a planet with that, that it would be harder for intelligent life and stuff to happen. Well, now because of the immense numbers of planets that are out there, the amount of planets that are binary are also immense. So just like I can't imagine the universe is any different than what I'm seeing out my window right now. These beautiful pine trees and cherry trees and cedars and poplars who dump mountains of seed potential every year on the ground, and for years I've watched them potentially fill grain towers full of potential that they have been fully achieved, but it never happens to all the other seeds. So I got the understanding by watching nature that the universe is very rich in showering potential in a world that very few seeds break the shell of ego and become their potential. So Gurdjieff was a contrast to Osho because they were really opposites in the way they taught, but that's why Osho talked about him a lot. And first thing I did after I was initiated by Osho and had that big non-event, which was my moment now to understand that I'm in the ocean. But everybody's saying, well, did you have an orgasm? What happened? Nothing happened. It was the biggest nothing I've ever had. From my head to my toes, nothing happened. But I've come to understand what Osho gave me was everything. But ego doesn't. Where is it? It's over there. It's over there. He did something by not doing anything because it's already there. But
amazing stuff, John. I just wanna thank you so much for what you've shared. I feel like I could just listen to you forever here. I feel I really enjoyed our conversation so much. I just want to slide over to Stephen just as we're sort of closing this episode up. If you have any words that you want to share, Stephen.
Yeah, it was actually, John, it was been amazing listening to you and speaking to you. But I just want to ask you another just very, very short question, if I'm allowed to slip it in. And I've been dying to ask it for the past half an hour. Does Nostradamus see any contact with friends from other worlds, aliens, in the very near future? What's happening in America with all this going in with NASA and all that? Why is that being revealed?
I've had UFO experience. I had a lot of them on the ranch. A lot of interest of people of other places were flying around, so much so that I literally, as a security guard, had an unofficial role of X-Filer. The series X-Filer was a beautiful fiction. I actually did the X-Files. I was the guy that they get anything in the special file. Oh yeah, there was something that landed by Moses Grove at the trailer areas. Can you go up there and see if there's any evidence? People said lights came down and landed, and talk to the people there. I'd go and do that. I was I was the X-Filer. And then I'd get a call from Antelope, where our school was, and adjacent semi-ghost town. And they were saying, oh, well, the cleaners at night don't want to go into the theater because there's this old granny dressed like she's in the 19th century floating around the ceiling. Okay, I'll check it out. Of course, I had another fun story, which is funny because being Arjuna, I read the Bhagavad Gita, and then 2 weeks later, I got the name Arjuna after being Dhyan John for a few years. And rather than having my Krishna, my master, say, go out and kill those people in the great battle of truth, existence wants you to do it. And I became the pest controller of the ranch. So I'm the flies were the Pandavas, and I was very good at it. And I thought, well, Osho's got a sense of humor. Arjuna's first job is to go fight a battle with the flies and the rats and the mice and the kangaroo rats and everything. And so some of the towns around used to listen to our radio traffic on Motorola's because it was just so damn entertaining. So all the bars, they were playing it. And so whenever Ravi Dasa was this child of a scientist, he was a scientist himself. So he was the mad scientist of our team. And then I was the other. So he'd call me and he'd say, brain to weapon. And I go, click, weapon. Well, we got this, there's this. And so, I was a pest controller. So that was one of my other jobs. But what was your question again? Just quickly, just a few words.
About friends from other worlds. Did not John
Yes, I got
see
it.
anything coming up?
Yes. Thanks. Nostradamus' last prediction that's dated is dated for the year 3797 AD. It's written in the original French numbers, 3797. And there are indications in his prophecies that his prophecies go a whole hell of a lot longer down than that. So there are definitely indications in his prophecies that we will become a galactic spacefaring nation, a civilization. So that's a future that's out there almost 1800 years, that date. It happens when the sun begins to expand and a great conflagration burns all life on the surface of the earth away, and oceans, everything. But he says the races of man will continue. Some will go to Aquarius. Others will go to Cancer and live perpetually. It's the only time he uses those astrological terms as places. So that's a big hint of what we're going to do. And he's talking about the dog-headed people, and some of the people he's talking about sound like they're alien contacts. And there's even one prophecy that's where a ship lands on an alien harbor and it unfurls its palm tree like a radar. He did predict the moon landing. He said man would be placed on the corner of Luna and walk in alien land. And so, that is there. So there's a lot of hints in his prophecies. And what I'm doing now is I am in the next 3 years finishing what will be 3 releases of 3 large volumes in 2026, 2027, 2028. That I won't call the name of what I call it. I will just say it is my Nostradamus project. And if Nostradamus were Wagner putting together Der Ring des Nibelungen, and this is what I'm doing with Nostradamus. I am, in all the books I've done, especially the one I did for Element Books in England, which is my 950-page version, that can only happen as the primary prophecies that we all know. The two prose letter prophecies, Epistle to Henry II, the preface to Caesar, and the 942 quatrains that survived the ravages of time. That's what most people know. That's not the complete prophecies. I am the reason I always felt I never had enough room to really give these short stories of the future, these 1,500 plus short stories of the future, their beginning, middle, and end, or give them chance to resume the story out of sequence 2-3 volumes down the road. This is why it helps to be dyslexic like Nostradamus to do this kind of stuff. You can see things in a different wired brain. Has to be dyslexic. So this, now I've come across there were 3 major serializations in the 1550s and early 1560s. So I'm modeling my volume sendings of 750 pages per volume. So we're talking about 1,250 pages and over 1 million words. That will give you all the predictions of Nostradamus that outnumber what's known in his almanacs from 1550 through to 1567. You will get an English translation of the Horus Apollo hieroglyphs book that never got published, but the manuscript survived. We're very fortunate. I'm very fortunate to be a study of Nostradamus because, given that he was at the forefront of the printing press revolution, he was one of the first major bestsellers of books. So, I mean, even some of his English translations of the same period survived. So almost everything he wrote survived because it was so much of it printed. And so when a story like Quatrain 35 of Century 1, the one that made him infamous and famous for the last 4.6 centuries, the death of Henry II in a jousting accident. What I do with that is I now have the room that if that story needs 20 pages, it gets 20 pages. And nobody reading it is going to feel like left out, like something was left out. And if their other quatrain might follow it, maybe it has one line. It goes to the next, So I gave myself permission to do this. I'll self-publish it, and I'll use Patreon to pay for it over these coming years by giving out some of it, of the updated versions, which haven't been updated since I did the last book in the mid-1990s for Element. And this is the project that will be the ultimate Nostradamus examination. And it's I'm not trying to do this to people, but it's just like Hanslick, the Viennese music critic, who often had sage things to say about Wagner and his revolutionary Nova Voce work since Tristan and Isolde changed the chords of everything and started all chords being flowing out of key. Just we make a new key each chord. That's what the Tristan chord did. Started modern music. And he made a sage advice, very prophetic. He said, my biggest problem with Wagner is he's advancing the genre of opera, evolving it so fast that it may be dead in a decade or two. It won't have anywhere else to go. And he was right. I mean, classical music is loved. More people listen to it than ever before. But can you cite, since Shostakovich died in 1970s, has there been any giants that everybody's listening to with new music? No. And in a similar way, which I'm writing about in my essays of late, is Wagner's revolution started when Neptune came into Pisces, its home ruling area, in 1848, 1849. That was called the European Spring of Revolutions. It came back after 165 years. It came back into Pisces in 2011, 2012. They called that the Arab Spring revolutions. What it means is that Pisces rules mass media from the unconscious, from the depths. So there was a revolution that Wagner was at the forefront of music, classical music, that brought it in his lifetime to being the rock music of the era. Everybody was going to the operas and all. So it was an art form, and what happens is it cannot last forever. These things have their window. Now, the cutting edge art form that's everybody is going to is cinema CGI. And the person who I think is the new Wagner of this revolution is James Cameron. What he's doing in these Avatar movies in visuals is probably the same thing that happened like to young Debussy listening to Wagner's Tristan chord for the first time. augmenting his whole world and making him the founder of French Impressionist music. Deep. I mean, when I saw the second movie and saw them splash into the water for the first time underwater, I was like, this is, to my eyes, what people must have been happening to their ears, listening to Tristan for the first time. And by the way, I highly recommend, if you want to hear it how Wagner wanted it played, because no conductor in this century has been playing the tempi the way Wagner wanted. They're all playing it too fast. And for like 53 years, I've been very frustrated with Tristan. I feel like there's something wrong. Everybody's so breathless and throwing lines at each other, trying to get to the next thing before they finish the last thing. Well, just a week or two ago, I stumbled upon a 1981 performance by Leonard Bernstein with the Bavarian Symphony Radio. And he did it the way Wagner wrote it. And people were afraid that they'd be too slow and people would get bored. Actually, they're getting bored because nothing is being fulfilled. It's like a bad sexual meeting. It's not quite coming together. But for instance, most people go da dee da da, and then rest. Da, dee, da. He did it like this. Rest. So riveting. That audience was not bored. I'm not bored. They did it in 3 concerts scattered across 1 year, just one performance. Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 in 3 different seasons. And in all 3, everybody is totally engaged, mesmerized. It's like it's become a Zen, Zazen, you're just like, the whole thing, and then everything works. The mad scene, I can't stand Tristan's mad scene. I don't know why, because he's just screaming and yelling and gasping. But when it's done slower, the madness comes in tidal waves, like with the grace of a great wave, and then goes. And it comes again, and then it goes. And then that famous thing where Isolde drops the torch so that Tristan can come running up for their liaison. And it sounds like the music is like da 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 da, and then she sees him da 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 da, but they go da 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 da. It allows the build up, the passion. And then when they hit, rather than throwing spitting lines at each other like everybody does, it's got another it's more it's caressing. When they break to talk after hugging each other so passionately, it's like, where are you? Hold me, not hold me. I mean, it's not the love of bunnies. It's savors, it's tantric, it's slow, and it's some of the most erotic music I've even heard in that regard, when people respect the master's tempi.
Absolutely. And just want to thank you for that, John. And I'm sure everybody's going to be checking out that version immediately as soon as they heard this. And I just want to show you just huge gratitude from myself and Stephen for taking part in this episode, for giving us your time. It's been a wonderful episode, and we'd love to connect with you for another one in the future.
Well, can I? Did I give you the details of where people can contact me?
Oh, please share them.
Oh yeah, you got them, right?
Yeah. We can. What we can do is, what we'll do, wherever you're listening to us, whether that be on Spotify, Rumble, YouTube, all these places that we are, You'll be able to see the links to connect with John and his whole prophecy website. We'll place all those links below. So if you want to connect with him, you want to find out more, it'll all be there. Is there anything you want to add, John, just as we close this wonderful episode?
Well, one of the things that I also do is I do readings on Zoom, and so that's also available. And you just put, well, you'll see the instructions that I sent, and also I have the Hogue Prophecy Report, which is usually a bi-weekly, if the world events allow it, me time. And so that's where I, unlike a show like this, which is kind of sampling stuff, this is where I ground everything I'm saying in the data, in the sources, so you can at least, I'm not just flying off the handle here. You can see why I say that, and this is the patterning and stuff, because I have quite an army of great sources, many of them also in England and Britain. So yes, that's the other thing. And drop me an email, send a question. I often or join. There's 3 ways to join my bi-weekly magazine. It's fully illustrated, lots of jokes. If you can't laugh at doomsday, what can you laugh at? So I try to take things that are really scary sometimes, not always scary, and then I find a way to be funny about it. I often tell my readers, when I'm really cracking a lot of jokes, you're doomed. But no. So yeah, come write to me. I respond to all my emails. It takes time, but I do. And I'm also inspired by your questions. You might find your questions becoming an article, especially. And you can see the free samples on my website at all times if you just want to sample it at hogueprophecy.com, HOGUEPROPHECY.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. And thank you to everybody who's listened along to this episode. Thank you for supporting this podcast, so we're able to connect with more like-minded people. Please leave your comments. We'd love to hear your feedback and your questions as well, and get in touch with John, as he said, and send these questions. And he does respond very quickly, actually, to his email. It's great to communicate with, and it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with him on this episode. So thank you so much, everyone. Until we speak again, we send you lots of love, friends. Goodbye.